and talk to you guys about step 2, which is identification of historic properties. I'm going to talk to you for a little while about determining what the area of potential effect is, and then Amanda's going to pick it up from me at some point and start talking to you about what historic properties actually are. So let's jump into the area of potential effects, also known as the APE. And so basically this is the geographic area or areas within which an undertaking may directly or indirectly cause alterations in the character or use of historic properties. So we're basically talking about, more generically, we talk about this as a project area. That's what you guys might refer to it or think of it as. So basically the APE or the APE establishes the boundary within which potential or known historic properties will be identified. So what are some of the factors that determine the boundaries of the APE? And so these are considerations that can come from a variety of sources. So these are considerations the federal agency may be having, considerations the applicant may be having, SHPOs and DIPOs, other consulting parties might think of how to define the APE in different ways, which is one of the reasons that this is also a part of the process where the federal agency needs to be consulting on, because all of these sort of different perspectives combined can lead to a better definition of what the particular APE is for a particular project. So some of those, some of those factors, simply where's the best location? Where's the best possible location for the project? What are the direct impact areas, primary or other? And this is the part that I think easily comes to people's minds when you're talking about the area of potential effects. What are the direct impacts or what are the direct effects of a project? But we also have to consider the fact that we also have indirect effects, or you can have indirect effects, such as visible, audible, or atmospheric impacts. I mean, we'll talk. You'll see that we're going to talk about this idea of direct and indirect effects throughout our presentation, because this is an important part throughout the 106 process to take these two things into consideration, both how you're directly and indirectly affecting historic properties in terms of the scope of your project. So we also think about things like the locations where the activity may result in changes in traffic patterns or in land use or in public access. And this next part can get a little tricky in this, because we have to not only think about, when we're thinking about these indirect effects, which are often, they're often occurring later in time, whereas direct effects are immediate, indirect effects are often occurring later in time. And so once you sort of add that dimension of time, you can get things like cumulative effects. So maybe initially an effect is small, but if you project that effect out over decades, and then you think of the cumulative effect of that effect, it might be a different situation in terms of how that effect is impacting historic properties. So we have to take into consideration effects that are foreseeable or cumulative. And then, as I mentioned, any other factors identified by the stakeholders, all those consulting parties that are involved in the 106 process, any factors they can identify. And so to determine the APE, you do not need to know if historic properties are present in the area. That's really what this step is about, identifying historic properties. So before you can identify them, you have to define your APE. So at that moment, you don't necessarily have to know if historic properties are present. And then lastly here, the APE is determined by the agency in consultation with SHPO and DIPO. So again, determining the area of potential effects is a part of the process in which the federal agency needs to consult. So we wanted to talk about just this one sort of this one thing here, which is called segmentation. And so segmentation is an instance where an attempt could be made to divide a project where you're only using federal funds in the parts that would not have an adverse effect on historic properties. And so this is not allowed. So the image I included here, so basically let's imagine a hypothetical road project represented by the blue line here. So this is in Jeff City. So this purple sort of cross-hatched area represents the Moreau Drive National Register Historic District. So this road project is going to go through this historic district. So basically what you can't do here, what would be segmentation if you did it, would basically be to say, okay, we're just going to spend federal funds on the parts of the road that do not go through this historic district, and we're going to spend some other kind of funds, some funds with no federal connections, to undertake the project that's going through the historic district. So that would be an example of segmentation, and it's the sort of thing you cannot do. An undertaking is an undertaking, and if there are federal dollars associated with it, then it is a Section 106 undertaking, and you have to consider the project in whole. You can't segment it in this way. So let's just go through a couple of sort of little thought experiments here and think about, in these couple of examples, what is my APE? So we recognize a property like this certainly as a sort of classic historic property, something like the Harry S. Truman home in Independence, Missouri. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very obvious when we think about any sort of project that's going to lead to directly impacting this house, something that's going to lead to the replacement of the windows, or it's going to affect it in any way directly. But what we might not think about are things like if a cell tower was being, or really any kind of structure was being placed in close proximity to this house. So imagine if I could overlay a cell tower back behind this house now. Architecture, like art, its value is in its viewing, and anything that affects our ability to view these properties and enjoy them as they were historically is something that can affect the integrity of these properties. So if you had that hypothetical cell tower, a quarter of a mile away, your APE is going to be the entire, the view shed of that tower, basically the area in which that tower can be seen. And so you would have to determine whether there were historic properties within that area whose view would be detracted by the presence of this tower. And so that's one example of indirect effects and how they could, talking about indirect effects, suddenly your APE is expanding well beyond that immediate footprint of that project where those direct effects are going to happen. You're expanding further out, and that expansion is often based on things like, if you're talking about a tower, something like the height of the tower. Basically how far away can you see it based on its height. So you're going to have some fluctuation there in terms of how you define things like the areas of visual impact when you're talking about your area of potential effect. So that's one example. One other, so this is an image of a battlefield. So again, it's easy to think in terms of, if there was a water line that was going to cross through this battlefield, we can understand pretty clearly what the direct effects of that would be. We would have ground disturbance, we would be impacting this property. But what we might not think about is if a highway was being built nearby. So battlegrounds are, their significance obviously are places of remembrance where we remember lives that were lost, battles that were fought there, and sacrifices that were made. So they're solemn places. They're often quiet places, or often park-like places that we go to for these sort of periods of remembrance and appreciation for what these people did. So that environment, that quiet, solemn environment, is contributing to the significance of this property. And so if you had something like an interstate that basically was being built here in the background, the introduction of that noise into this environment would have an effect on this property, assuming it was a historic property. It's something that would have to be taken into consideration. So your APE, again, where you have to expand beyond that immediate footprint of that road, and you have to think of things like auditory, vibrations, other kinds of impacts that are indirect from that road. And therefore, again, you're defining your APE based on this area of all of these possible effects. You're not just constrained to that area of direct effects. So before Amanda takes over, we just want to throw this in here just to make sure to see if anybody has any questions right now. Amy, I can't because I'm controlling the PowerPoint. I can't see the questions in the chat. So if you could just tell me if there are any.
I've been answering the questions as we go along.
Okay.
I'm muted. I've been answering the questions as we go along. So if there is anybody who would like to answer a question, you can raise your hand or enter your question in the chat now. Daniel Road What?
Hello? When Amy's talking, Jeff, can you mute? Because when we're in the same
Yes,
room, the echo happens. Thanks.
good idea.
So Daniel wrote his question is, how are temporary impacts taken into account when defining an APE? So like you borrow areas. I'll mute.
Okay, so I believe the question was, how are temporary impacts taken into account when defining the APE? Well, that's a good question. It's such a generic one. I don't know that I'd be able to give you a strong answer because it will obviously depend on the nature of the effects. And that's something that, it would have to be presented to a number of different parties because, SHPO versus THPO versus a local historical society are going to think about these, that sort of question differently, and how something might affect a historic property. Each of those entities are going to think about that question differently. So I suspect you would have to have a pretty specific example of effects and present that, and think of it in the context of what I raised earlier in terms of, even if it's temporary, does it have a potential, temporary in what sense? Temporary for a moment, but then it's going to return. So then you're going to possibly get into that area of cumulative effects. So yeah, that's a tough one to answer. I suspect that's about as good as
Jeffrey,
I can do.
do you want to talk about it maybe in the sense of staging areas?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I see what maybe perhaps that is what he was getting at. So yeah, staging areas. So if you had a road project, any kind of construction project, you could have temporary areas. They're not necessarily where the road is going to be built, but they're staging areas where the construction crews are going to temporarily be. So something like that is certainly part, again, we haven't really gotten to the topic of ground disturbance yet and archaeological concerns, and what we'll get there eventually. But that would certainly be an instance where, if you're really going to go in there, land level an area, prepare a pad for, your construction crew to have their operations, that could certainly would certainly be considered in the same sense as the construction of that road. It's a part of the undertaking. It's something that's happening because of that undertaking. Therefore, you would have to think of that as part of your APE because that is an area that's going to be impacted directly as a result of that project.
So the next question is, does Missouri require an APE buffer for solar projects? If so, 1 mile, 2 mile? Do you want to answer that one, or do you want me to, Jeffrey?
Yeah, you can go ahead,
Okay.
Amanda, since you're the structures person.
Yeah. So for solar projects, a lot of times, and same thing with wind projects, is it comes down to if there's a federal tie in the project. So for most of those that we see, there's not always a federal tie. If there is, a lot of times it is the Corps of Engineers for a permit, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So their APE, the way they draw their APEs is a little bit different than what we've explained here. And that's kind of a class for another day because they have something called Appendix C, which allows them to draw their APEs a little bit differently. It's not something that's been signed off on by all parties. So it's kind of a sticky subject that we could talk about on another date. If you have a project involving a core permit and you want to speak with somebody, Amy is our expert on core and in our office, and she can help you with that. So if there were a solar project that had a federal tie that maybe federalized the whole project, which everything, any undertaking except for those that are core projects, $1 federal, $1 federal permit federalizes the whole projects. So if there's another federal agency involved, then we would want to look and see what the project was doing exactly and customize the APE with you. So that would be a case for you to reach out for us to discuss your solar project and what exactly is going into that. I always recommend when you have a solar project or a wind project, if you would like to reach out to us and discuss the project, even if you're not sure if there's going to be a federal tie, just send me an email or give me a call, and I'm happy to discuss that with you. And that goes back to what Amy was talking about earlier, is it's always, it's always never too early to start consultation with our office on a project. In the chat earlier, I mean, Amy answered it, but I think it would probably be good for everybody, Jeffrey, if you would address when you're determining boundaries for the APE, do you have agencies specify the depth in addition to the two-dimensional boundaries?
Yes, certainly. In instances where you're going to have ground disturbance, you would certainly, you would want to think of your APE in 3 dimensions. So it's not just the horizontal across the ground surface boundaries. You're also going to want to know to what extent the ground is going to be disturbed vertically. This is especially important in areas like alluvial plain environments where you have flooding for thousands of years, and you could have ancient soil horizons, ancient ground surfaces that are buried deeply. So in those instances, if you're going to be coming into an area like that and doing deep disturbance, it would be very important to take that into consideration when you're talking about your APEs. You're not just talking about your horizontal boundaries of your project, but also thinking about that third dimension as well. It's certainly something that should always be considered.
So the next question is regarding our digitized system, and I'm going to let Jeffrey answer this too because he is the lead on that project. It says, will the new digitized system you are working on include access to maps of eligible and listed historic resources in Missouri?
Yes, it will. So you guys are probably, many of you, at least the professional archaeologists, and many of you have probably seen the results of these kinds of searches, even if you aren't professional archaeologists and have access to our database. But we have an online GIS where you can view all kinds of data, architectural structures, archaeological sites, National Register sites, and the list goes on. And so that whole system will be basically integrated with this electronic 106 system that we're talking about. This is all in the future. This is all hypothetical, and basically what I'm describing is what we want. So don't hold me to this, because what we end up with, we'll see what resemblance it bears to what we want. But that's certainly our hope, is that GIS system will be integrated so that it'll just be a seamless part of the process when you're dealing with 106 at the Missouri SHPO. It'll be part of that process for you, access to that data.
And I'll add that right now you can view our National Register listings and our architectural surveys and certified local districts. There is a map tab on our website that's available to everybody, anytime on the maps tab on our website. So you can see that part, but determinations of eligibility are right now just on that part with, access by qualified archaeologists section.
Yeah, the tool we call Archaeology Viewer is the one that has limited access. But yeah, like Amanda said, the public can get access to any of that other data that's not the protected archaeological site locations.
Yep. So the next question is regarding segmentation. This sounds like something that can be attempted by an agency in the planning stage, but not sure if this is something that consultants try to do either. What are the legal ramifications of segmentation? Does this lead to a bigger issue for the parties attempting to segment a project?
You want to take that one, Amanda?
I can. So a lot of times a project will be planning, and they might look at a whole road, kind of like Jeffrey was saying with the road, or you might be looking at it with a structure, and I can use an example for that too. But sometimes they'll just kind of try and leave things out of the scope of work. So, the example there with Jeffrey had with the historic district going right through it and kind of saying, oh, we'll leave this part out. It's a little more obvious that they're kind of doing something there. You're like, well, what about this part in the middle? But, we might also get a project where they're like, oh, we're going to build this new building on this vacant lot next to the historic property, but the historic property is not part of the project. So, but then when it turns out is they're actually demolishing the historic property for a parking lot. So that brings into question the segmentation there, and it also in that case where I was saying they would be demolishing the building next door, that would be also could potentially be under anticipatory demolition. So it's really important that you provide your whole scope of work on there, because it could jeopardize your federal funding and it could jeopardize your project. So knowing what exactly is going on is very important. I hope that answers your question, Brandon. If not, let me know. Emily Reed asks if we could clarify Appendix C. Amy, would you like to discuss that?
Yeah, I can discuss that, Amanda. So Appendix C is something that was made up by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Regulatory Department that has laid out how regulatory has chosen to do business. It has been not been signed by the ACHP or any SHPO. So it isn't actually it's basically an outline of how the Corps does business, but it doesn't because nobody else has agreed to it. It's up to the agencies if they want to comply with it. Exactly how Appendix C works, I can't explain because it's part of the problem is that it's a little variable in language and in they are not required to do under Appendix C. They have not stipulated that they will conduct tribal consultation. They have cut the SHPO consultation period to 15 days, a whole bunch of different things. But Appendix C is regulatory, core regulatory, how they have decided to do business. No one has agreed to it, but that's it. They're still using it. And because the federal agency is the one driving the bus, that is how they have chosen to do business.
I'll also note that we do not complete reviews in 30 days for them either, even though that is
in
their
the 15 days.
Yeah, 15. Sorry, we do not complete reviews in the 15 days. Thank you, Amy.
Yes. We do in the 30, but not 15. No.
Yes.
Because
do you want to answer? Emily also posted a follow-up. Is Appendix C specific to certain USACE regions or nationwide?
It is not specific to regions. It is specific to regulatory. So their regulatory department. Some regions may or may not use it. Most of them I've heard of do, or in some form do, but it is specifically for their regulatory department. It is not the entire USACE agency that uses Appendix C.
We have one about Appendix C in emergency situations such as levee repair. They want to know if it's used.
No, they usually have separate PAs or program comments or agreements depending on the situation and the levies, because those levy types have gone up in different ways. And so it depends on the levy, it depends on the emergency, it depends on the situation. Some of them have come probably through Appendix C, but because part of Appendix C is that they do not follow 106 and they do not have to submit everything to SHPO, it's hard to say if things have been submitted to SHPO for review or not.
And also, if it's an emergency situation, and Amy's going to talk more about this later, but I'll just touch on it right now, that there is a section of the of the regulations for Section 106 that address how we respond to emergency situations. And so they kind of have a little bit different process if it is a declared disaster and emergency. And she can talk more about how disasters get declared and everything like that. So look for a little bit more about emergencies when we get to that part. So we had one more question, Jeffrey. It says, when the new digitized system when will the new digitized system be rolled out, and will consultants have access to submit Section 106 projects for review?
Yes, that's literally the entire purpose of the system, is to basically allow consultants and applicants and everybody who's part of the Section 106 process to submit their materials to us. We do not know when it will be rolled out. We are merely observers in this process to a certain extent, because we are relying upon our GIS experts in our IT department to develop this. We are one of many irons in their fire, and so we're hoping to be pretty close to a final product by the end of this calendar year, as I believe Amy or Amanda mentioned earlier. But again, that's our hopes, and we all know about hopes. It may or may not come true, but we'll see. Everyone keep their collective fingers crossed, and maybe we'll get there. And I believe Amy had shared with me that Gina Powell had asked a question about what is a historic property, and thank you for that question, Gina, because that's a perfect segue into Amanda's section, which is what is a historic property. So Amanda, I'll let you take it over from here.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey, and thanks everybody for your questions. So we're going to discuss, like Jeffrey said, what a historic property is. It looks like we've had one question come in, though, just really quick. So I before we move on to this section, we have, oh yeah, we can do a break. But before we do the break, let's answer this question and then we'll do a break. So we have a question about viewshed. Cassie, would you care to tell us a little bit more about your question about the viewshed?
Yes, sorry to just jump in there. So I was thinking about what your cell tower, Jeffrey, your example of the Truman House and the cell tower or some sort of, tall structure. And it kind of seemed like a chicken before the egg, where you mentioned that the APE is not reliant on historic properties, right? Like you would establish your APE you establish your APE first, and then you look to see if there's properties in the area. So for something like a cell tower, I assume your viewshed is established from the tower or to the tower, but I'm imagining a situation where any tall structure, you would establish your viewshed, but then you may not be able to see the historic property from the tower or from the position on the ground, certainly. And then, but if you go to the other side, the front of the house, and you look back, and then there it is behind the house, or, how do you, it seems like you would need to identify historic properties in the area first to properly make a viewshed or an APE?
Not to define your APE. So in the case, again, since we're being very specific, I can speak specifically to towers. So with the tower, the APE is based on the height of the tower, and the FCC nationwide programmatic agreement provides that information for how to determine how high, based on how high the tower is, what your diameter of your visual APE will be. So it doesn't matter whether or not there are historic properties present. When you are defining that APE, then once the APE is defined, you would go and look and see if you have something like that house, the Truman House. If that house was present within that whatever quarter mile, half mile, 1.5 mile, whatever your visual APE is, you would then identify whether or not historic property is present, and then a consultant would go and basically make an evaluation of whether or not that tower what's present in the view shed of the structure. If you
That
want,
makes
if
a
you
lot of
want some
sense.
specific,
Okay.
yeah, so you want some specific information about how that view shed is established or how that assessment is made, I'll turn that over to Amanda since that's her area of expertise, but perhaps I answered your question.
Yes, you definitely did. Thank you very much.
Great.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and take how many minutes were